Hello and welcome back to our video series on digital reform. Today we're talking about dark patterns, what they are and how the legislative landscape that regulates them is going to change. To help shed some light onto this dark topic, I'm joined by my colleague Aoife Coll, Associate in the Technology and Innovation Group.
Thanks, Aoife.
So we're talking about dark patterns today, which is a term that people may be familiar with. They'll have heard it in a data protection or even a consumer protection context. But could you unpack a little bit, what does this term actually mean?
Yeah, so there's no generally accepted definition of dark patterns, but it is typically understood to refer to deceptive or manipulative practices that maybe lead persons to take acts that they didn't intend to take or want to take, especially where this has negative consequences for the person.
Okay, so this kind of nudging type behaviour. In terms of the legislative landscape at the minute, how are dark patterns regulated?
So dark patterns crop up in the data protection context. Neither the GDPR nor the e-privacy directive specifically refer to dark patterns, but both of those pieces of legislation form the legislative landscape that regulate dark patterns. An example that we're probably all familiar with is cookie consent.
Too familiar.
Exactly. So when an organization is seeking consent to non-necessary cookies, if that organization perhaps provides information around those non-essential cookies in a way that doesn't provide the full picture on the cookies, or perhaps nudges the user to accept all of the cookies, that could constitute a dark pattern. And in that instance, the consent that is being provided may not be a valid consent under the GDPR because it is not freely given or maybe wasn't fully informed. So there you're going to be running into Article 5 issues under the GDPR, so the principles of transparency and lawful and fair processing.
Okay, so that link with kind of general principles, particularly fair processing, transparency, that's really key to how they're regulated at the minute.
Yeah.
So I suppose then taking a look into the future, how is the legislative landscape for dark patterns going to change?
So the DSA is quite different in that there's an explicit prohibition on the use of dark patterns in a way that deceives or manipulates recipients or otherwise materially distorts a recipient's ability to make an free or informed decision.
And does that prohibition cover all practices?
No.
No.
So that's where it gets a bit more complex. So the caveat is that the DSA prohibition doesn't apply to practices that are already covered by the GDPR or the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive. And the recitals to the DSA also make clear that the prohibition won't apply to practices that are compliant under EU law. So for example, if there's advertising that complies with EU law, the DSA's prohibition won't apply there.
So some big carve-outs there. So what's kind of left within the scope of the DSA prohibition?
Good question. So the only obvious area where the DSA's prohibition would apply immediately is in respect of business-to-business practices, because the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive wouldn't apply there, as that is consumer-related legislation.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, that's a bit unsatisfactory, as there has been little enforcement to date around dark patterns, and it's kind of seemed like neither the GDPR nor the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive have been particularly effective at regulating dark patterns. So giving both the GDPR and the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive primacy in the DSA kind of leads to the situation where it appears that the prohibition in the DSA itself might be relatively weak in practice.
Okay, so that kind of practical application then, it almost makes our discussion today seem a little bit academic in nature.
Yeah, to a certain extent, but it is clear that the intention of the legislature is to prevent these practices. And it's important for organizations to try to avoid dark patterns, because it's kind of unimportant as to what legislation the dark patterns are being regulated by, whether that's the GDPR, the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive, or the DSA itself. Organizations should seek to avoid these practices generally.
Okay, so really the kind of key takeaway for organizations is to come back and focus on those key principles that you mentioned earlier around transparency and fairness, which they have to comply with under the GDPR and data protection law generally anyway. And as long as kind of the focus remains there, all will be well from a dark patterns perspective.
Well, we hope so. So if organizations bear those principles in mind, there should be little or no concern that their practices could distort recipients' ability to make free and informed decisions.
Well, thank you very much for sharing your insights on this topic today, Aoife. That's all we have time for in this video, but all of the videos in our digital reform series are available on the Arthur Cox website. Thank you very much for watching.